Y'all, just so you know, I'm repping my Black Educators Matter shirt. There's so much good merch out there for Black History Month. Pick you up some, wear it, rock it every day to school, get your students involved in it. Highly recommend. Hello, and welcome back to That's Just Good Teaching with me, Deanna Smith. Today, we are going to be talking about one of my absolute favorite subjects, and that is Black History Month. Black History Month is an opportunity for teachers across the country to celebrate Black excellence, Black history, and most importantly, Black futures. But it can be difficult to approach. For a lot of teachers, they just don't know where to start. Whether you're a veteran teacher or you're a true beginner, I hope to give you some tips today that'll help you make this the most meaningful and joyful Black History Month your classroom has ever experienced. So let's get into it. Let's get started with a few missteps or pitfalls that I see happening in a lot of different classrooms when it comes to Black History Month or really just any culture month. One thing is focusing too much on slavery. Now, it might seem intuitive to want to talk about slavery because it is a part of American history and it is really important that students understand the impacts that we're still experiencing today of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. But Black History Month is not the best time for this. And I know that a lot of textbooks actually line up Black History Month with around the time that they start talking about slavery. So sometimes it can be difficult because that's what kids are actually learning about in social studies. But slavery is really a bigger piece of American history and also white American history. It's not the biggest critical component of Black history. And focusing on slavery gives kids and students the false impression that Blackness is all about strife, struggle, or what was done to Black people in the transatlantic slave trade and in slavery, especially in the American South, but really all across the North American continent. It's really critical that your students understand that Blackness is so much more than just slavery and civil rights. So it's definitely important to still talk about these things, and you do want to make sure that you're covering these issues and you're covering the reality of these issues throughout the school year, but Black History Month just is not the best time to do it. The next pitfall that I see some teachers falling into is that they focus on things like craftivities or little cutesy things that they see on Pinterest or Teachers Pay Teachers. Now, absolutely nothing wrong with a craftivity and learning that incorporates some sort of artistic expression. I think that's a great thing. But I think the pitfall here is when you incorporate a craftivity or an activity and that's the full story. You don't dig deeper into more issues in the Black community or more celebrations of Black folks or just learning more about the Black experience. Instead, it's just one craftivity. Maybe it's at the end of the day on a Friday, and then it's kind of out the door we go. So a craftivity is a great place to start, but it's not a good place to finish. And my dear friend, Naomi O'Brien, who you might know from Read Like a Rockstar Teaching, always says some subjects are too important for just a craft. And I totally echo that sentiment. So it makes sense to incorporate those activities, especially if you're lower elementary, but then hey, I'm a big believer that big kids like craftivities too. It makes sense to incorporate those as part of a bigger picture and a broader scope of what you're doing, but that should not be where you begin and end your Black History Month celebration. So we've talked about the pitfalls and the what not to do's, and there's probably a bunch more, but I just wanted to kind of give you that initial list. But let's talk about what you should be doing. Let's talk about the yes do's, the must do's, and the ways that you can make this Black History Month meaningful, joyful, exciting, and just really, really juicy and impactful for your students. So like anything teacher related, the first step is to make a plan. Make it an actual month. Make it an actual kind of like a unit, a scope and sequence, maybe something that isn't just focused on one or two things at the end of the day on Friday. I know it can be so tough because it feels like you have to try to cram everything into your classroom instructional time these days and then somehow miraculously make it through all of your curriculum. But the time that you spend investing in learning about Black history with your students will pay off. And there's a ton of ways to make it actually connect to what you're already learning. So it's kind of like knocking two things out at the same time. So you want to think about making a strategic plan for the entire month. If you want help with this, of course, I do have a resource. It's called More Than a Month, and it is a planning guide complete with resources for not just Black History Month, but like pretty much any heritage month. It has resources for a bunch of different ones, and it's meant to be reused so you can put things together. But if you're not able to like look into that at this time, this resource, I would just really recommend taking one of your planning hours, if you get planning time during the day or a little bit of time after school, and thinking about how can you kind of piece together a unit, make a story as opposed to just activity here, activity there, kind of thrown in everywhere. But really think about making it a whole month for your students, for them to engage in. If you have like a teacher team or co-teachers, perfect. Like one person can plan math, one person can plan social studies, one person can plan science, or each of you could take a week. There's lots of different ways to make it much more sustainable for planning. So I know that planning time is hard to find, but if you think about ways that Black History Month can actually fit into those other subjects, you'll be knocking two things out at the same time, and also showing your students that it matters to you, right? It matters to like say, there is a lot of things that we should be doing, but this is important and it's worth us prioritizing. That in and of itself is really meaningful, and it shows your students that you think that Black History Month matters and is important in your classroom. All right, the next thing that you can do, y'all, is bring in the community. This is one of my, just in general, ultimate tips, just when you're thinking about anything, bring in the community, but especially with Black History Month, if you're available to. I grew up in a very, very not diverse, very homogenous area. And when I was a kid, there weren't, like, I was really the only Black kid at the school, but there weren't resources outside in the community that people could bring in for Black History Month. So my mom actually came in for Black History Month and brought food and talked about the culture. And it was a really meaningful moment for me. And I think your students can get so much out of incorporating families, out of incorporating, if there's community centers. Some of you live in cities where there might be like a Black History Museum or a Black Culture Museum or a Black Culture Center. Anything like that is amazing. Even like if you're in an area, sometimes there's Afro-Latino cultural centers. All of that is awesome, and it's a great way for students to see that the school is really part of this bigger story of the community. I'm not going to get on a soapbox here, but overall, just bringing the community in is a great way to practice asset pedagogies. But in particular with Black History Month, see if there's a way to bring the community in. Maybe you live in a place where that's not an option. There are plenty of virtual tours. You could get somebody to Zoom in to the classroom. You could take a virtual field trip or an in-person field trip if you're able to. And I think if you kind of look around in your area, you should be able to find something, even if it's just a statue or a monument or a library. Sometimes there's Black cultural libraries in our community. So do a little bit of research and see if there isn't a way to bring the community into your classroom and bring the classroom into the community to celebrate just like the Blackness that exists, not just in the history books, right? But around us right now, as you're watching this video, there's all kinds of exciting things happening in the Black community. So this is an opportunity for your students to see you tapping into that and for them to understand how to tap into that as well. So make sure to connect it to the community. All right, this next tip is very important, and it's something of a mindset shift. So bear with me. Think about actual, like the trajectory of Black history as opposed to just thinking of times when Blackness shows up in white American history. What do I mean by that? And for those of us, if you're teaching in the United States, Black American history, but really if you're anywhere, Black people kind of interjecting into the dominant history. Here's what I mean by that. We already talked about the Parade of Firsts a little bit. And so that's kind of showing times when Black people pop up in just an overall story that we tend to tell. Our typical social studies curriculum tends to focus on one viewpoint and one advantage and prioritize one set of experiences. We know this. We're teachers. We've seen the books. We've heard the critiques, right? And it can be difficult to try to figure out how to push back against that. And I want to continue to give you all tips on that, and more tips are coming, maybe even a video on kind of decolonizing history. But in the case of Black History Month, let's think about ways that we can really tell stories of a Black timeline. So I'm thinking of opportunities to talk about Blackness throughout history. So instead of focusing maybe just on Langston Hughes, Maybe your whole unit is on the Harlem Renaissance and really talking about the history and rich cultural rejuvenation that happened there. Maybe you're talking about Marcus Garvey. Maybe you're going all the way back and talking about different African cultures, because Black history includes, Black from a global perspective, that kids don't really get to learn about that much. We learn a lot about maybe the Greeks and Romans, but we don't learn as much about what was going on in Africa at that time, for example. You can talk about the history of Blackness just in the whole North American and South American continents. Talk about Afro-Latino identity and Afro-Caribbean. There are so many ways to focus on like the story of what it means to be Black historically right now and in the future, that don't just focus on finding where Black people show up in white history. I'm hoping that makes sense. It's kind of a abstract idea that you need to kind of like grapple with and think about a little bit, but it's something that I notice when I work with a lot of teachers is we just try to find Black people. So we end up kind of focusing on Black people in white history as opposed to just telling a concrete story of Black history itself. Something that I notice with teachers, that especially if you aren't super familiar with Black history yourself, and that's understandable because again, we're teaching in the school system, most of us, that we actually learned in, so there's a chance that that's kind of been an intergenerational gap where we haven't learned a lot about Black history. So when you're thinking about Black history, don't just focus on, the heavy hitters who are important, but let's, broaden our perspective a little bit outside of just telling the story of, segregation and civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks. But dig in there, see if you can find, if students even can lead this work, they can find stories of Black history that really should be more prominently studied in American history. There are a lot of different ways to go, and I hope you will, if you're still struggling to figure out what this looks like, just kind of sit with it and think about what that means to really focus on Black history throughout, the existence really of a Black identity, instead of just focusing on Black people as it pertains to white American history. And it's not going to be, the easiest thing, right? It might be a little challenging because when you go look for resources, you might find that most of those things are just talking about like the first Black person to do X, Y, and Z. And that's okay. You can sort of kind of build your own resource bank as you continue teaching over the years, and get more and more familiar with it. But I think there's also, you could think about different ways to incorporate Blackness into different subjects. So thinking about what is like a Black understanding of stewardship, like how are Black cultures across the world, right, stewards of the land that they're on. So that's a connection to like environmentalism and science. You could do, a Black art history unit, like talking about Black art traditions, whether it's African styles or Afro-Latino styles or whatever styles you can learn about. You can think about Black art history as one example. So there's lots of ways to look at it from that perspective and to see just Blackness throughout history and give your students a really robust, well-rounded experience of Black people, Black excellence, and of course, Black futures. And my last tip, and maybe the most important, bring in joy. We kind of talked about this earlier when we were talking about focusing on like slavery or civil rights. And I think we want to strike that balance of the material reality of oppression and systemic racism in this country. Very much a thing, yes. But we also want people to understand that Blackness is more than just, suffering and tragedy after tragedy. It's joy, it's resistance, it's all of this beautiful tapestry of culture. And so make sure that you are giving your students opportunities to be joyful, right? Whether it's like learning about different dances that were influenced by African tribal dances across history, whether it's art, whether it's through music. There's so many ways to bring in joy. So just make sure that you are creating that space for joy. And honestly, that's the advice that I give teachers just across the board. Make space for joy in general. But I think when it comes to our cultural months, it can be challenging because teachers well-meaningly want to make sure that students understand the gravity and the material reality of oppression. Important. And racism, important. But at the same time, make space for joy. So as you're making your plans and as you're looking over your schedule for Black History Month, take a second double check, say, hey, where did I make space for joy? And if you don't see anything, that might be a sign that it's time to go back over those plans and make sure you add some joy. Thank you so much for rocking with me here today. I love Black History Month. I love talking about it. I love helping folks plan it. Make sure that you're following me across all the social media channels because I am giving out a lot of tips for Black History Month and linking some resources as well. I think there is so much on the internet already, great resources that you can be implementing. So if you want to see what I would recommend, make sure you're following me, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, all that jazz. And I hope you have a wonderful Black History Month. Remember, if you're feeling a little nervous, you want just a few more resources, or you're thinking ahead and you're thinking, how am I gonna make multiple culture months meaningful and joyful? Don't forget to check out More Than a Month, which is my planning guide and resource bank for culture months. It's reusable, it comes with resources, you can implement it again and again, and it is really what I needed when I first tried to start putting all this stuff together. So I made it over the years, and now I have made it available to y'all. So make sure you check out More Than a Month if you would like some help planning Black History Month and culture months in the future. But either way, I wish you the best of luck, and of course, happy Black History Month.